Today we're going to talk about the history of computers. Before you start programming, it's important to have an understanding of where this device, the computer, that changed mankind came from. If we go back in time, humans have always been obsessed with counting things. They use their fingers, they use objects, anything around them to keep track of the things that are important. What makes humans so much different than animals is that we are tremendous tool makers. And as our ability to create tools increased, we soon made mechanical devices to do the heavy lifting of math for us. Then, once we created electricity, we were off to the races, and we were able to make the digital computing devices that you recognize today. In the early days, however, it was small handheld devices like the Abacus, Napier's bones, and the slide rule that were used to do critical tasks like accounting, keeping track of crops, and so forth. The Abacus is a tool that most of us are familiar with. It's extremely popular, especially in Eastern cultures. It's used to help young children learn how to count and do basic math. An abacus normally has two sets of beads, heavenly beads and earthly beads. These beads are strung across rods, and the beads can be manipulated in order to do what we call arithmetic operations, addition, subtraction, and so forth. Once we became better tool makers, we started making larger, more complicated devices like the calculating clock, the Pascaline, and difference engine. All of these devices led us on our odyssey towards the modern computer. But what changed things? The biggest thing that makes computers possible is electricity. With electricity, we're able to represent information using something very small, electrons. Without electricity, computers would be far too large, far too slow to do anything really meaningful. So once we had electronics and electronic components, it was only a matter of time until someone created what we know today as the computer. What's the idea? Inside a computer, we can use electronic components almost like a series of switches to represent the smallest unit of information. The smallest unit of information in computing is called the bit or binary digit. Binary is a fancy word for a 1 or a 0, something that is either true or false, yes or no, on or off. By stringing together ones and zeros, we can represent almost any piece of information we want. Because of all this, man was on the search to find the perfect electronic switch, something that could be used to represent a 1 and a 0. Early on, electromagnetic relays were used as this glorified on-off switch. We moved to vacuum tubes, and then one of the best inventions of the 20th century that changed mankind, the transistor. If you look at any of these early technologies that were used to represent ones and zeros, they all have the same thing in common. They're controlling using the power of electrical current to represent ones and zeros. Let's talk about some of man's early electronic computers. In 1941, a German inventor named Konrad Zuse created something called the Z3. The computer you see pictured here is his invention. It uses a bank of electromechanical relays to represent ones and zeros. In this case, relays were used as the glorified on-off switch. In 1946, the U.S. Army at the University of Pennsylvania came up with what's called the ENIAC, a vacuum tube-powered computer that was used to calculate ballistic missile tables. And then, in the mid-50s, the Air Force and AT&T got together and created the first fully transistorized computer, the TRADIC. Konrad Zuse is an important figure in all of this. During World War II, there were many different people working on what became the first computer, but because of the fighting, we didn't know what each other was doing. So Konrad Zuse was working on a computer while people in the United States were working on the computer. There was very little communication about who was doing what. The ENIAC is an amazing computer. It's huge, it takes up rooms, and it's still on display at the University of Pennsylvania. But the most important invention that created the computer is called the transistor. It replaced the bulky, power-hungry, error-prone vacuum tubes and allowed us to be able to put billions and billions of ones and zeros together. Transistors are one of those things that are concurrently extremely simple and extremely complex. The complexity comes in the actual manufacturing of these semiconductive components, but the simplicity lies in the fact that at the end of the day, by manipulating electrons, we can store billions of ones and zeros in a very small area. Individual, discrete transistors were still too big and required hand soldering. They weren't going to get us where we needed to go. And so came the idea of the integrated circuit, a way of packing multiple electronic components all together onto a single semiconductive chip. This was invented in 1958 and led to the microprocessors that you may be familiar with today. Integrated circuits are exactly what they sound like. They integrate electronics together, thus making them smaller and more efficient. All advanced electronic devices have what are called integrated circuits. The invention of the integrated circuit led to the next family of computers, known as mainframes. Mainframes feature integrated circuits with thousands of transistors on them. This right here is an IBM System 360. Mainframes like this were normally only owned by large institutions with big pocketbooks, and they were made primarily by IBM, International Business Machines, and 7 of its close competitors. After mainframes came the microprocessor. A microprocessor is a programmable semiconductive chip that has all of the electronics integrated into one or very few circuits. A central processing unit, the thing that does the work within your computer, is considered to be a microprocessor. It is Intel that brought microprocessors into the fore. Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce created Intel in 1968, and in 1971 they released the first commercially available microprocessor, the 4004. The 4004 looked like this little bug you see here, and it only had 2,300 transistors. Intel created, for all intents and purposes, Silicon Valley, and Noyce and Moore are considered to be the fathers of Silicon Valley. Over time, companies like Intel and AMD found ways to put more and more transistors on a chip, and the more transistors, the more power. When it comes to microprocessors, their speed is measured in what we call clock speed or frequency. You may have heard things like 1 gigahertz, 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz. Well, a 3 gigahertz processor can calculate 3 billion instructions per second, and they keep getting faster all the time. It wasn't long until geeks and hobbyists wanted in on the fun for themselves, and this started the personal computer or PC revolution. People would buy kits like this Altair 8800, which included an Intel 8080 commercially available microprocessor, and they would put them together and teach themselves how to program. From there, the rest is history. We started off with different forms of personal computers that led all the way to the smart devices that you use today. The next phase in computing was multi-core processors. Manufacturers had a hard time putting more and more transistors onto a single chip, and so they decided to put a bunch of chips together. And this started what we call parallel computing. So the solution here is to break up the processing and send them all to their own virtual processors. It's kind of like many CPUs on a single CPU. By dividing up the work, we increase the performance. Not necessarily by putting more transistors in a smaller space, but by separating things into cores that each can perform their own functions and parallel process. You probably noticed that computers just keep getting stronger and faster. It's something that we just take for granted, that the computer we buy next year will just be more powerful. Well, this isn't a fluke. This is actually called Moore's Law. And yes, it was created by the person who co-founded Intel. What Moore's Law states is that the number of transistors that we can pack on a chip should double every 2 years. So this is a prediction of the rate of processing power and its growth. From 1975 to 2012, manufacturers like Intel and AMD were able to come up with chips that doubled the transistor count every 2 years, as indicated by this graph. However, it's getting harder and harder using our current technologies and manufacturing processes to keep doubling the number of transistors that go on a chip. Advancing computing power has always been about miniaturization. We moved from the vacuum tube to the transistor to the integrated chip and so forth, and with every move we were able to represent ones and zeros in ever smaller spaces. But now we are starting to reach the limits of what we can do with semiconductive materials and current day production processes. As we look towards the future, manufacturers like Intel and AMD are going to come up with new production methods and new materials like carbon nanotubes in order to keep Moore's law in effect.